All right, so we talked last time about Freud and the idea of personality and how that develops. And Freud was a psychoanalytic, so he's looking at the unconscious. But so how do you assess the unconscious? Because it's all, that's in our mind. So how does psychologists kind of tap that information out of you? It's usually through projective tests, so things like a personality test, such as the Roche Inkblot test, or something called a TAT, which is a thematic apperception test that provides ambiguous stimuli designed to trigger projection of one's inner dynamics. So, for example, with the thematic perception test, the TAT, it's a projective test where people express their inner feelings, their interests through the stories they make up about ambiguous seats. So psychologists would show somebody a picture of a horse or a farm, and they would ask the person to create a story based on that picture. And the idea is that through that story, your unconscious motives, your unconscious desires, those things come through. So they use those pictures in order to kind of generate the topic of discussion and see really what is on your mind. So you can see here a picture of something like that a psychologist would give, and then they would ask the client to come up with a scenario, a story about that picture. And the psychologist would then take notes on the picture to see what it was about and kind of then break it down to really see what the person is thinking about. The Inkblot test is probably the most widely used projective test. It's a set of 10 Inkblot tests. It's designed by Herman Roche. It seeks to identify their inner feelings by analyzing those interpretations of the blots. A lot of people are very, very familiar with Inkblot tests. I will tell you that most psychologists today kind of discredit Inkblot tests and say that there's no real, remember that psychology is really based on that scientific method, and that there's really no way to go about looking at Inkblot scientifically. But you can see here the idea of assessing the unconscious is they're given those ink blots. We'll look at some of those and what they look like in class. We have looked at some of those, and you've also created those as well and kind of analyzed what you thought your ink blot test said. So some neo-Freudian, some newer Freudian theorists. One is Alfred Adler. He talked about the importance of childhood social attention. Alfred Adler was very kind of weak and sickly, growing up, and so he talked a lot about how that dynamic growing up, your childhood, is going to influence your future. Then you have Karen Horney, who was sought to balance Freud's masculine biases. Freud was pretty biased toward men. He thought that women had penis envy, that women, subconsciously in their unconscious, their super ego was weak, and that we would constantly be doing what gave us instant gratification, and that we all secretly wanted to be male. And so Horney is going to kind of balance that theory and say, guess what, Freud? We don't all want to be men, and tries to really discredit that idea of penis envy. And then you have Carl Jung, who emphasized the collective unconscious. He said that we had a concept of a shared, inherited reservoir of memory, so that we all had these shared kind of memories. Jung is not so much. People don't really kind of disagree with a lot of what he said today, and he's been a little bit discredited, but you do need to know who he is. The idea thought, for example, that idea of mothers all being nurturers, so that is a collective, part of our collective unconscious, part of our collective memory. So then we said in development that you're talking about the psychoanalytic perspective, and then you also look at the humanistic perspective. And so Abraham Maslow is going to be that humanistic perspective, the idea that self-actualization process of productive, healthy people. So as long as you are a productive, healthy person, that's what you're striving for, this goal of self-actualization. At the top, he had a pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid was that idea that you are self-evolved and that you have a real sense of purpose, that you don't have any sense of prejudice, that you are kind of that ultimate person. And I think when you think about maybe people like Mother Teresa or Gandhi, people who just kind of go, above, because Maslow is going to say that most of us don't reach self-actualization. We are constantly working on it as a process. So self-actualization, the ultimate psychological need that arises after basic physical and psychological needs are met and self-esteem is achieved. And so, that's why you do have to be like a healthy, kind of happy adult. That motivation is driving us to reach our full potential. And so people who may have like some type of disorders, learning disabilities, anything like that they don't necessarily have those same goals that we have. So at the bottom of the pyramid are things like breathing and eating and sleeping, and then as you go up the pyramid, you need to fulfill one to have the other. And so you have things like safety and security, but all of those needs have to be met before you can get to the very top. Carl Rogers is also going to look at the humanistic perspective. He focused on growth and fulfillment of individuals. He looked at things like genuineness, acceptance, empathy, that those are the things that we need to kind of grow as individuals. And that's what drives, remember, all of these things are what drive our personality. So he talked about unconditional positive regard, which is an attitude of total acceptance toward another person. And I mean, if you think about this, think about how hard that is to really love someone unconditionally, totally accept them for who they are without any ifs, ands, or buts, like total acceptance toward another person. And then they also have this idea of self-concept, that all of our thoughts and feelings about ourselves, in an answer to the question like, who am I? And really trying to figure out, who are you? And that's a hard question. I mean, you think about it that it's easy, but really thinking about who you are as a person can be a very difficult thing. And these are also things that evolve. So these are goals that the humanistic perspective said that we are all trying to reach. Also looking at contemporary research focuses on what's called the trait perspective, which is still part of this, humanistic perspective. But the trait perspective looks at a characteristic pattern of behavior, a disposition to feel and act as assessed by self-report inventories and peer reports. So like a personality inventory questionnaire that you might take that says something about your personality, true, false, agree or disagree. They're all over the place. I take them all the time when I see links to them, like on BuzzFeed or something like that. That's a personality inventory. People respond to items designed to gauge a wide range of feelings and behavior, and then we use those to assess selected personality traits. So we've done some of those in AP Psych, like your right brain, left brain, those type of things. Those are all about your personality. The trait perspective, Hans and Sybil Eisnick used two primary personality factors as axes for describing personality variation. So you've got everything from introverted to extroverted to unstable to stable. And so you're looking at all of those things kind of in between. Where are you at on that spectrum? Where do you fall? One of the ways that we can do that is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, the MMPI. It's probably the most widely used, researched, and clinically used of all of the personality tests that are out there, and it's available. We'll look at some questions, some sample questions, but it's actually like 365 questions. Some of them are even closer to 400 questions. They just vary depending on which one you take. So even though it shouldn't take you that long to take it, it's a lot of questions to kind of sit through and go through. But it was originally developed to identify emotional disorders, and that's still usually considered the most appropriate use for it. But it's used for a lot of other screening processes, purposes as well, and processes as well. So it's used for a lot of different reasons, but again, it's probably the most widely used and the most widely researched, and we'll look a little bit more at it in class as well, and I'll give you some sample questions of what you could be asked. Empirically derived test is a test developed by testing a pool of items and then selecting those that discriminate between groups. So the MMPI is an example of an empirically derived test. So these tests have a bunch of different items, and they use to kind of break people up into different groups. So you can see here the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Test, the MMPI. You can kind of see what the different personality forms are. So you kind of take the test, and then you should fall into the spectrum of 1 through 10. And so it's, before treatment, after treatment. The idea is that it gives psychologists kind of a basis, a scientific method to, you know, where do you start versus where we're going to move you to if you come to them for treatment purposes. Okay, so then we're looking at trait perspective still. And so this is actually what's called the Big Five personality. And I think the easiest way to remember this is by the acronym CANOE. CANOE. So there, over there on the side, you see, like, for example, the C is conscientiousness, and it's a spectrum. So you go from organized to disorganized. So whereas, like, the Minnesota, the MMPI was asking you to, like, pick one or the other. Like, I like ice cream, I don't like ice cream. This gives you more of a spectrum. So you can be careful versus careless. The A is agreeableness. So something like being soft-hearted versus ruthless, helpful versus uncooperative. Neuroticism, sometimes it's looked at as emotional stability versus instability. So calm versus anxious, secure versus insecure, self-satisfied versus self-pitying. Again, a spectrum. Then you have openness. Are you imaginative? Or are you practical? Are you independent, or do you tend to conform? And then for the E, you have extroversion. So sociable, retiring versus retiring. Are you fun-loving, or are you sober? Are you a very affectionate person, or are you more reserved? So the trait perspective, this is the Big Five. And again, you can remember it by the acronym CANOE, or sometimes people remember it as OCEAN, because they don't have to necessarily be in that order, but you do need to know what the trait dimensions are, and then you need to kind of have an idea of what some of those endpoints of the dimension are, because again, it is a spectrum, and so it gives you more of a wide range. So make sure you check these out. Next class, we're going to look at a couple more, or next video, we're going to look at some more perspectives. Make sure if you have any questions, that you ask them in class. And again, we'll look at some more questions that kind of pertain to these, what psychologists are looking at, how these questions are worded when they're asking you to categorize yourself into these personality, into developing and trying to look at what does your personality say about you.